Well, welcome everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Tim Hitchens. I'm the president of Wolfson College. And tonight we're going to talk about the art collection at Wolfson College, particularly the African art collection we have here at the college. We're very lucky indeed with the collection. The collection in many ways is focused around two individuals. One is Godfrey Lionheart, who we'll hear about later, who is one of the early governing body fellows of the college. And another is Chris Levitt, who's been a very generous lender of his works, particularly more modern African works, to the college. And why are we interested in African art at Wolfson? Well, I have a personal interest. When I used to work in the British Foreign Office for 4 years, I was what was called slightly pompously the Africa Director. So I had first-hand experience of working with many African colleagues around the continent. It's also true that at the moment the works of African artists are developing enormous markets around the world. Prices are going up. There's a great deal of interest, particularly West African art, and therefore it's an opportunity to see a growing art market. And I think it's also important for us collectively to reflect upon our position as a college based in one of the great old universities of the world, but trying to be as international as we possibly can. And looking at these art collections is a way, I think, of talking a little bit about who we are, how the world has evolved, and what we can think about what is coming. So, when I used to work in the British Foreign Office doing the Africa job, this is the map that I had on my wall. And as you can see, it's a map of Africa, of course, but it's a map of Africa that turns itself upside down in two ways. First, purely geographically, so we're all used to the map that shows Africa with the other way up, with the north at the top of the map. And of course, implicitly, that places Europe above Africa and Africa below Europe. And this map turns that on its head, as it should be. And secondly, this map sets out the names of African cities, great African cities, as they are known by the populations of their own ethno-linguistic community. As you can see, there are very few, surprisingly few, you might say, written languages that are not Roman language. So here on the eastern side, we have Amharic, the language spoken in Ethiopia. Of course, we have Arabic here, spoken in Sudan and in Egypt, what is now South Sudan as well. And here in the northwest of Africa, we have the Berber languages. So here we have Rabat, and we have Algiers, and other North African countries and cities. And so as you go around, we have the pronunciations that are different from our European pronunciations. So this is what we would know in Europe as Dakar, in Senegal, Conakry, Abidjan. Here we have the Accra and Lagos in Nigeria, Kinshasa. And here we move into the south, and here this is Johannesburg, is known here as Igoli. And then we move around, and Mogadishu in Somalia. So the point really is to say that as one looks at art from Africa, if we're sitting in Europe, if we're sitting in Britain, we, I'm afraid, constantly have to think about our assumptions sitting where we do. Is there such a thing as African art? How do we avoid the challenges of condescension that come with the colonial heritage? And I suppose the fundamental thing I tend to think is that art is not anthropology. We're not looking at this art in order to understand these countries better. We're not looking at this art, indeed, to understand a European perspective better. We're looking at this art in order to understand the human condition better. So we can be very conscious of questions of identity, national identity, community identity. But my purpose today really is to look at the art itself and what it tells us about what it is to be human. And I should first of all say that I am certainly not an art expert. I'm not an expert in African art. So really what you're seeing here are pieces that have inspired me, pieces that have made me curious, enthused me. But if you are after real detail as to how these individuals produced what they produced, then please do look at the material that's online. There's some wonderful stuff out there. This is Wolfson College, and as you can see, we're a college that was created in 1966 and was built in the early 70s, and saw itself as very much a new kind of Oxford. We were still a monastic community, we were a community of learning, but we saw ourselves as having shaken free of some of the old hierarchical assumptions of the past. We felt ourselves to be egalitarian, we felt ourselves to be very international, we felt ourselves to have shaken off the prejudices of the past, and I think there were some remarkable things that were done in the early days of the college. One can look back and see ways in which we hadn't yet shaken off all the things that we might have shaken off, but I think there is a certain similarity between the way the college saw itself in the 60s and 70s and the fact that this was the era of decolonization. And I think it's no surprise that the college, in trying to forge an identity, took on works that were modern at the time, works of the 60s and 70s, and also we've continued that tradition with works that are contemporary. And it's no surprise that we wanted, as part of our collection, to include some works that represented the new spirit in the African independent nations that was happening at this time. Now, if you talk to Western art historians about the influence of African art, people will always say, yes, it started with Picasso, didn't it? And of course, Picasso was one of the first, along with Georges Braque, great Western European artists to recognize the artistic potential, particularly of the masks that were being looked at in Africa at that stage, and incorporating the strengths from these masks into the works that he produced. Here we have Demoiselle d'Avignon, 1907, very explicitly conceived and inspired by a number of African masks which Picasso had been seeing. And of course, here you see the evolution of formalized female faces into faces that are very, very much inspired by mask work in Africa. These masks that you see on either side of this picture come from the Dan ethno-linguistic group that one comes across in places like contemporary Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia. And these masks are not simply masks of people, they are masks that are meant to convey power, and in this particular sense, convey a certain amount of threat. And I think what you find again and again through looking at art from the African continent is that idea of potency in the artwork. It's not simply a representation, it's certainly not an impressionist surface of things, brilliant surface of things. Absolutely, it's going down into the structure of things and it's creating power as it speaks to us. So here is Godfrey Lionheart. Godfrey was one of the very early governing body fellows from Wolfson College. He was an anthropologist, particularly specializing in what was then called Southern Sudan, is now the independent state of South Sudan. And Godfrey and his brother were great anthropologists who clearly spent much of their life traveling. So here is a picture from 1960 of Godfrey in southern Sudan among Dinka people that he was studying as an anthropologist. But he recognized that there were artworks from Africa which should be or could be very much part of the culture of Wolfson, this new college as it was emerging. And so he was asked and went to Camden Art Centre, which in those days, based in North London, was a centre that seemed to specialise in African art brought from the African continent to the UK, or indeed African art produced by African artists based in the UK. And so he went to a particular exhibition. It's an exhibition in August and September 1969, and he purchased some of the works you're going to see here, focused particularly on West African art. And I just want to read to you an introduction to that exhibition, which is both perceptive but also indicates some of the challenges even then of looking at African art. So this is the introduction by a lady called Jacqueline Delange, who was in charge of the Département de l'Afrique Noire at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. And I think wherever one goes in this world, one comes across phrases that you think you couldn't use that phrase now. So l'Afrique Noire is clearly a phrase that would not be possible or appropriate now, but this is the way sub-Saharan Africa was described in those days. And she writes, has the, quotes, darkness of Africa been much more a question of our own inability as Europeans to relate adequately to Africans than a lack of light on their part? And so she's asking herself those questions. And one does, if one is sitting in Oxford looking at art here, think, how has it ended up on our walls? Is it painted? Who is it painted for? Who is it created for? Is it created for an audience in the country in which it was created? Is it created for an international audience? And of course, all those questions come up as one is looking at these pieces. Godfrey, and I should say, was loved by all of his students. And if you were going to be taught by him, sometimes you were taught in the study, but just as often you would like to be taught in the pub. And he had a series of pubs in North Oxford that he particularly enjoyed taking his students to. And there's a Horse and Jockey, which is no longer a pub, actually, 69 Woodstock Road, just opposite St Anthony's, which closed in 2002, but that was a great favourite of his. And then Victoria Arms in Jericho, and the two Gardener's Arms, one in Plantation Road and the other in North Parade, were places that he would take his generation of students and collaborators to discuss anthropology in Africa, but also looking at the art more generally of Africa. So let's look at some works to start with, and we have to say that the works that we have at the college are primarily Western Africa with a certain amount of East Africa. We have very little from Central Africa, nothing from Southern Africa. So there are all sorts of areas of African art that one is only scratching the surface of here. But let's go back to here. This is Nigeria, and around 1895, there was a pupil in one of the mission schools in Nigeria, a man called Aina Onabolu, who began to copy illustrations and pictures from imported magazines and newspapers. And he really is regarded as the very first Nigerian artist to use Western media. So Nigeria first was, as it were, the city of Lagos, had a major British presence, a major British invasion in the 1850s. And for 50 years, Britain extended its control, and by about 1900, it became formally a colony of the UK, which it remained until 1960, when it gained its independence. So it's quite a good sense of a location that was becoming a colony, that was undergoing the challenges of the colonial administration, that got its independence and then had to work with the grain of what it was to be independent. And so Onobolu here, this is often regarded as the first masterpiece of modern Nigerian painting. So here it is, 1905, so just about the same time as Picasso was producing Demoiselle d'Avignon in Paris. And it's a picture of somebody called Mrs. Spencer Savage, and Mrs. Savage was a socialite from Lagos, part of the glitterati of the Lagos society. One of the striking things, if one looks at West Africa compared to East and South, is even though these countries were held by Europeans under a colonial yoke, there were many fewer Europeans in these countries and in the society of these countries than there were in the East and the South. And for a very simple reason, Europeans survived much longer physically. You could actually live and create a life for yourself in the East and the South in terms of the climate, whereas West Africa was a very difficult climate to survive in as a European. And certainly before quinine arrived, the average lifespan for a European in anywhere along that slave coast, as it was known, was no more than 1 year. So very few Europeans actually spent a great deal of time, and that meant that despite colonial administrations, the numbers of Africans who were able to play significant roles in society was probably greater than in the East and the South. So here you have Mrs. Spencer Savage, and again, it's clearly a piece of art which is trying to rise to European artistic styles, as was perceived by Onobolu himself, the word rise being one that he would use. And it's a very nice piece that captures an individual. Now, of course, Onobolu felt that Western art was the art to which one should aspire. And he invited a man called Kenneth Murray, or he advised the colonial administration to invite a man called Kenneth Murray to come to Nigeria to teach art. Kenneth Murray himself being the grandson of James Murray, the original editor of the OED. But of course, Kenneth Murray arrived in Nigeria and said, you need in Nigeria to be producing art that is true to your own heritage rather than trying to reproduce art from Europe. So Onobolu's style here by the 1930s was no longer the style that was encouraged in Nigeria. And that was a style that was meant to be truer to the spirit of the original communities, the original ethno-linguistic groups in Nigeria. And this is where we come into the first artist who we have at the college. This is Asiru Olatunde. And he was born in 1918. So he was developing his artistry through the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. But his artistry was very much based around the ability to produce craft work, the ability to beat copper and aluminium, the ability to produce earrings. He became a drummer in his local church and was a great drummer in his early years, but then his father converted to Islam, and he then himself, clearly with his father, became Muslim and was no longer able to be the drummer. So he had to leave the church and the drumming that he loved so dearly and became a maker of earrings. And in the early 1960s, he was therefore operating in a place called Cocobo, which is halfway between the old capital of Lagos on the coast and the new capital of Abuja in the center of the country. And halfway between these two is this extraordinary place called Cocobo. And in the early days of Nigeria, a whole series of Europeans began coming to this newly independent state, wanting to support, as they saw it, the emergence of a new art that matched the independence of Nigeria. And so one of the earliest people that this group came, and there were a particular group of people that were coming from Austria and from Germany. They came and they identified this gentleman, Olatunde, as one of the artists that they would encourage. And so he began producing works that you will see, if you come into college, you will be able to see sitting just outside the lower common room. So a place that used to have lots of photographs of rowing teams from our glorious history of rowing in college. That has been replaced by a series of beautiful pieces of his. And these look like what you might call classic repoussé work, i.e. the technique of having a piece of metal, going behind it, and with a small hammer banging things out so that they came out onto the surface, so it began to look a bit 3D. His technique was slightly different, and he tended to work on the front surface and then bang into the front surface. But again, what's very striking about his art is, first of all, it comes from the tradition of the Yoruba. And the Yoruba is one of the major ethno-linguistic groups in Nigeria, but also in neighboring Benin. And if you look at Nigeria now, it fundamentally has three areas to it. It has the southwest and south, which is the economic heartland, where traditional leaders would come from, where Lagos and Abuja and where the Yoruba are. Then in the north, you have a vast area which is the Muslim part of Nigeria, taking in the influence from further north where Islam came in. So Islam came in from the north across the Sahara into Nigeria and all the other West African countries. And then the area in the southeast, where the predominant ethnic group is called the Igbo group. This is where all of the oil of Nigeria is based. So it is the wealthiest in terms of natural resources, but it's also the areas that have been most exploited by the rest of Nigeria. And traditionally, the power in Nigeria is a balance of those three areas. And in the early years of Nigeria's history, of course, in the 1960s, we had the Biafran War, a war in which fundamentally the southeast of Nigeria declared independence and the rest of the country went to war. And we saw extraordinary scenes of suffering and famine as a result of that unsuccessful uprising. So here with Olatunde, we have fundamentally Yoruba view of the world. Now, the Yoruba bring with them an animism to their traditions, but many are also Christian, and there are some as well who have great collaboration with and tolerance with Islamic faith as well. In the very early days, southern Nigeria was covered in this deep forest, but as population has grown, as the economy grew, that forest was decimated. And certainly if you travel around southern Nigeria now, very little forest remains. But it was a Yoruba tradition that wherever there was a town, then near it you had to have a sacred grove of trees, and these were the original forests of the country. And so Yoruba tradition very much focuses around forests and trees, going back to an earlier age. And Olatunde works exactly in this tradition. Trees appear again and again. Animals appear, but animals that are not 2D and are not 3D animals. These are very 2D animals, two-dimensional, but they have an extraordinary power and presence on on the work. And here again, classically, there is no perspective. So you've got two groups of people working in the trees, but this group is exactly the same size as this group. You'll often have people not always up in the same vertical position. You'll sometimes have people walking around the side of the piece. And the forests here you can see have fruit in them. And one of the striking things that Olatunde often does is you're not quite sure whether you're in a Yoruba world or a biblical world. One of the things that strikes me, just again, I try occasionally in this talk to pick up things that it reminds me of in Western art. And of course, nowadays in European art, you have a very few numbers of works of art on a wall. Back in, of course, the 18th and 19th century, the European tradition was to pack the walls with as many works of art as you can. And that's absolutely the same tradition here that Olatunde is working in, filling this space as full as it can be. And that sense of potency and power and being full is really central to his work and a great deal of West African work. Here's another piece that is well worth looking at. Again, this is trees from which you get the liquid that allows you to drink palm wine. So palm wine, a widely used alcohol in West Africa and Nigeria, massively central to the culture of many West African countries. So here you have somebody climbing up the tree with the string or the rope around them to allow them to be safe as they go up, carrying their bottle, and they have cut little incisions into the side of the trunk, and from those comes the liquid that goes into the bottle that then is distilled later into alcohol. And don't you just love these butterflies and cicadas who are so thick and strong and heavy, they would never stay up in the air at all, but their presence, again, for me, captures that sense of being in an African, West African night, the thickness of the air, the presence of the insects. And so these poor creatures would never stay up in the air, but they give a sense of the human experience of these insects that is extremely powerful. Here again, you have another work by Olatunde, and this is, again, a work from the Bible. This is clearly Noah's Ark. And again, it allows Olatunde to pack as many animals as he can into one scene. So we've got lions, we've got snakes, we've got birds, we've got our famous cicadas up there, we've got pigs of some sort, all absolutely packing the environment. And again, this sense of animal, and we have fish down underneath and lizards and reptiles underneath, this sense of an absolutely packed landscape and seascape, which is just full of life and vigor. Here's another one we have in the college. When I've given this talk before, I thought these might be Islamic images from the north of Nigeria, but they're not. This is ritual entertainment and people playing instruments. Here we have things that look like whips, but I imagine are whips that can be used to crack and make a sound. And again, we've got these wonderful birds that would never be flying, with these faces that look directly at us and the beaks that are entirely unrealistic. But again, it's packed with people, with life, with vigor. And here it just gives you a sense of the town of Oshogbo. This is what it looks like now. And those of you who've not traveled in Africa, this is in some ways a very typical town that is buzzing. And just outside of Oshogbo, we have this shrine. And in fact, this is probably one of the most sacred shrines, one of the most sacred locations in Oshogbo and across the whole Yoruba. There are woods behind here that are indeed the original native wood from the early years. And I think this is one of those locations where people would be looking at the goddess Osun and an idea of a Garden of Eden, the biblical references, as well as the earlier references all combine in a location like this. And here you have the palm wine collectors. Sadly, nowadays it's more efficient to use plastic bottles, and the ropes are not the original old ropes, but are a more modern form of rope. But this is a very, very common scene as one travels around Western Africa. And here again is a little bit more of the collecting of the palm oil and taking the palm oil away to be prepared for the celebrations. And again, just a reference to what else was going on at Europe at the time. Here in 1956, about the same kind of period, we got Picasso based in Vallauris, just in the southeast of France on the coast, producing his own repoussé work in his own inimitable style. So I just thought it'd be interesting to see the kind of work that was being produced by the great European master at exactly the same time. Now, there are other artists that I wanted to draw your attention to. And here is Chief Jimo Burimo. He's the next generation on from Olatunde, Nigerian, Yoruba again. And those of you who have been in the common room at the college will recognize this work. I apologize, it's my photograph, so it's got a certain amount of reflection on it. But again, he uses beadwork on screens like this to have pictures that include both animals, that have formalized human faces. Are they masks? Are they human faces? That again fill every part of the picture. And again, for me, it brought up memories of Joan Miró from Spain, the surrealist from the 1930s, that sense of filling the space with slightly magical figures and faces. When Chief Burimo gets it right, I think he does brilliant work. And this is, I think, a classic example of a beautiful figure. The color is just so vibrant. It seems to go to a very original place as far as he's concerned. Burimo continues to work for many years. He's still working, I think. Here's a piece from 2011. I've got to say, I put this in, we don't have this piece in the college, because it does show for me some of the risks of producing works of art that you know are going to be for a European or North American audience. I think this has lost some of the vigor of the early works, and certainly the work we have at the college. I think it gives the market what it wants from Chief Burimo, and if the market is happy, who are we to complain? But I don't think, for me anyway, it has quite the vibrancy and quite the brilliance of his earlier work. Let's now look at another Nigerian artist who we have in our collection, and his story really is extremely different. So this is Eze Egonu, and he was, again, slightly different generation, born 1931, but when he was born, he really wanted to be an artist. He wanted to train as an artist, and his sense was to be an artist in the way that he wanted to be, he had to have formal education in art. And for him, as a Nigerian, that meant London. So he was one of the very first in the late 40s to come to London in order to formally study art. And he settled in the 40s, and with the exception for 2 days in the 1970s, he never went back to Nigeria, never went back to Africa. And so he was trying to forge a style that was his own style, wrestling with what his identity was. He came from Nigeria, as it's now known, but he was one of those people who came from the Igbo southeast of the country, the oil-rich part that tried in the 60s to have independence and failed. And so he has always been interested in what is his identity. Is he a member of the British Empire? Is he part of independent Nigeria? Well, he had left independent Nigeria by the time he became independent. Is he Igbo? Well, yes, he would say he's Igbo. Is he British? And it took a long time for the question of could an artist born in Nigeria call themselves British? But there was a point in the 1970s where the British Council, trying to take a set of works of art to many countries around the world, wanted a sense of what it was to be a British artist in the 1970s, and included his works of art among those works. So clearly for the British Council, they hoped to be able to appropriate his work as British art. This is an early piece from the early 1960s. I think you can see it in the corner in the photograph. Again, it's the famous palm wine being collected. Again, you've got the rope that you see. But I love this piece because there's a sort of a stiffness to it, to those legs, that links with the power and the strength of the rope that is holding him upright. Because if that rope weren't there, he'd be falling down to the bottom right-hand corner of this piece. And it reminds me, you know, of plenty of Degas works where you have sort of the strength of the piece comes from the sense of something could move if only it were not being held in place. So this is a lovely piece from 1960. Then here's a piece from 1974. Again, the colors, the movement are wonderful. This is Sacrificial Cocks. But again, it feels to me that it speaks to an African heritage, but it absolutely speaks to the kind of things that we were having on our walls in the 70s. That sort of sense of broad, bold design down here in the right corner. The sense of the cock's heads having basic elements that are repeated again and again. And then here we come to 1978. And this is the piece that we now have in the college and is lovely to look at, called A Woman Reading. I think it's very, very appropriate to the college itself because we are a place of study. This sits on the corridor just outside my office, the president's office. And again, it's just beautiful, and it's in tune both with an African identity, but a British identity and where modern art is at this time. The way in which, like Henry Moore, you have no facial features, that is, looks like a stone sphere. The way that you have this table, the lamp sitting upright on it, and the perspective being irrelevant to capturing the sense of the weight of a lamp on a table. The line here of the fold of the book going into the fold of the legs and then the fold of the knee, wonderful echoes there. The female, because clearly there are two breasts, but the way this breast is depicted and the way this breast depicted balancing each other because they're very different kinds of shape. This arm looking so different to this arm, the strength of this arm, the narrowness of this arm, and the concentration, the heart of this painting being the effort of that, the top of that head looking down at that book, and this being what it's all about, study by this woman of a book. Wonderfully powerful, and I hope when you're able to get back into college, you're able to come and look at it. And we've made sure in the rehang that this painting is right next to the paintings, the works by Olatunde that sit in exactly the same part of the college. So you can see this painting with the Olatunde works all at the same time. And we've also actually, if you just go around the corner, we've got this work that we've placed there as a nice counterpoise to the painting of Women Reading. This is Sir Henry Fisher, the first president of the college after Isaiah Berlin, painted by his wife. Again, a former judge, High Court judge. But again, it's rather nice. We thought it was a nice, as it were, joke, as it were, to see these two pictures counterpoise with each other. And here, just to get you a sense, here's a David Hockney painting of exactly the same year as the Egonu painting. And it gets the same sort of, if we can go back, the same sort of cool 1970s feel that the origins of Wolfson are so much about. And I honestly think the 70s is due for a revival. And I think these works of art are the kind of works that will really be coming back into their own. Let me go, if I can, now to completely the other side of the continent, and to Ethiopia. And so again, this is an artist called Wassane Ethiopian, born in 1950, learned his art craft in the Addis Ababa School of Art. And here, you'll remember earlier on, we talked about Amharic as the alphabet of Ethiopia, one of the few alphabets in Africa that we know of. And his mother was illiterate, and all the money that she could, she saved to send him to the church school, where she insisted he learned how to write Amharic and English. You may know the history of Ethiopia, the modern history of Ethiopia. In 1972 or 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie, had been in power for decades, was overthrown by a very communist, but a Leninist communist coup, and he was killed, and the Derg, this group led by Colonel Mengistu, took over. And it became really quite difficult to operate in that environment. And so in 1977, Wassane moved to America. And he has stayed in America ever since. He's carried on working in America, deeply inspired by the jazz music tradition of America. But he speaks very much, he tries to depict himself as a voice of Africa. But it just raises for me some questions of, if you've lived since 1977, so since you're 27, in Africa, sorry, in the United States. Again, at what point do you become an American artist? At what point are you an African artist? Those questions of identity are interesting to look at. Wonderful, I should say, wonderful shirt. And in fact, several of these contemporary artists have the most wonderful shirt sets. I'm extremely envious. So here is, for those who've not been to Ethiopia, the extraordinary landscape of northern Ethiopia. His work by Wassane, the sort of the vividness, the activity, these are not actually Amharic, but they've got the sense of being letters of some kind of digital script. This is the piece that you will be able to see of his in the upper common room. And again, you can see the Amharic script in there. You can see letters and numbers. You can see the sun, the moon, the landscape. This actually is a very, very tiny piece of work, very intense. I think of it as a little bit like Ethiopian coffee, very strong, but really delivering a punch and repaying the attention to it. Here's Mondrian, Broadway Boogie Woogie, and you can see the way in which these two echo each other. He's absolutely in touch with the 20th century North American and European art scene. And my favorite artist of all time, I'd love to talk about him in great detail at some point, Paul Klee. And again, that sense of a landscape with numbers and figures and letters in it, and the fact that landscapes that artists create don't need to be the kind of landscapes we can see with our own eyes. They can be landscapes we see with our imagination. Two more artists I wanted to show you. This is Dominic Zinpay, one of the coolest of all our artists, I think. Here's another wonderful picture of him. Again, look at that shirt, what a brilliant shirt. And I love wearing caps like that, so I'm enthralled by his cap. Again, one of the most stylish artists around. He's from Benin. So Benin, to the west of Nigeria, Francophone, so part of the original French colonial structures. But also Yoruba, so within exactly the same Yoruba tradition as those earlier pieces from southwest Nigeria. And here behind him, we have a piece which is one of many pieces he does, which works upon the idea of twins in the Yoruba tradition. So in the Yoruba tradition, for various reasons that nobody can really work out, there are many more twins born into Yoruba families than there are to any other ethno-linguistic group around the world. There must be something genetic in it. And this has led to a particular cult and culture of twins, where people believe that if you are a twin, you share one single soul. And if, as sadly happens, one twin dies, you have to create a figure of that twin, and these are very much in that tradition of figures of twins. And then you feed that figure of a twin in your home with food, with water, with love and affection, in order to keep the soul of the other twin alive and sustained. This is Benin, and just again, for those of you who haven't visited West Africa, the colours are not extraordinary. The colours are extraordinary, and this is everyday life. So everyday life in West Africa is a blaze, a riot of colour, just wonderful. And this is the Dominic Zinpay pieces. You'll see these. We have two of them in the Haldane room. They are ghostly. They are hard to picture. They suggest death. They often suggest pregnancy. They suggest fecundity. They're unsettling. They certainly are not, in any sense, going back to an original tradition. This is an artist struggling with what one should say in the late 20th and early 21st century about the experience of living in Benin. Again, very unsettling figures. These hands, you will often see different coloured hands that are significantly bigger than they should be in proportion to the body. So again, great sense of foreboding about what those hands are going to do. Here you have hands that appear to be embracing a figure with their back to us, but there's something very bloody and unsettling about what those hands appear to be doing to the back of the person they're embracing. So there's masochism, there's sadism, there's unsettling images going on. And again, we don't have this one, but it's just, again, a beautiful one that he's produced in the sense of the twins that is very much in that tradition. And finally, one of my favorite artists from Ghana, Ablade Glover. Again, what a fantastic shirt. If only I could find that shirt. He still works. He's in his late 80s. He started life studying in what was then called the Gold Coast. He then came to the UK, particularly to Newcastle, where he learned his trade. He moved from using brushes to using to putting paint on with a palette knife. Colour and crowds has been what he's really interested in, and then he spent most of his career teaching art in the university in Kumasi. And Kumasi is the centre of the Ashanti region. And just as a diversion, the Ashanti region, people may have heard of the golden stool of the Ashanti. It's one of these extraordinary stories. So the sovereignty and the spirit of the Ashanti nation in Ghana resides within this golden stool that only the king of the Ashanti can sit upon. And there was a point in 1900 when the British governor of what was then Gold Coast insisted that the Ashantis gave him the golden stool so that he could sit on it and assert British sovereignty. And this led to the famous War of the Golden Stool, which ended up with an accommodation between both. And so the Ashanti recognized British sovereignty over their region in Ghana, but they retained the right, only they could sit upon the golden stool. So the heart of the symbolism remained with them, but the British colonial administrator, the colonial overlord, took over. So if you know Ghana, you know that kente cloth is at the heart of Ghanaian design and aesthetics. Everywhere you go, what people are wearing, what they have up in their shops, what people use around the house, this brilliant, vibrant kente cloth. And here is the experience of a market in Accra, which is, again, what Glover was trying to capture, the sense of busyness and vibrancy. This is the piece we have up in the Haldane room in the college. Two women in a marketplace, sizing each other up, comparing the one to the other. Great height, great dignity to them. And the setting at the back is this wonderful market fizzing with energy. And here's another of his pieces. I love the way in which, from this piece of ours, which you can see very clearly what the subject matter is, you move into a piece that is really much more about the crowd and the market. And here's a further piece where it almost enters abstraction. You get the sense of energy, busyness, repetition, but the individual humans have almost been lost to the overall effect. And I wanted to end, if I could, just with some quotes from a blood lover, because I think he's such a wonderful person. He said, in the beginning of my career, I would mix colors and then apply them to the canvas. Then I progressed to mixing the same colors, so I would work with varying tones. And I'm now doing something which surprises me, working with contrasting colors. The colors I'm putting on the canvas now almost look crazy together. But when I stand back and I look at the work, I can see the evolution. There's a shift. I'm experimenting with new colors. The subject matter stays the same. The crowd has been my love. I will continue to paint the crowd movement and the crowd spirit until I die. Wonderful pieces of work. Much more that could be said about art across many other parts of Africa, but I hope that's given you a sense of the artwork we have here at Wolfson. I'm particularly conscious of those of you who, because of the pandemic, have not been able to come in. I hope that gives you a sense of the pleasures and the surprises to come when you are able to come in and see this new rehang of the wonderful work that's been lent to us or is in our possession. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it gives you an insight into an enthusiast for these pieces of art. I'd love you to come and look at them yourself and create your own views of these extraordinary pieces. So thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed that introduction.